Oh, let me introduce you. Speaking is Tristan Davis. He is, where are you a professor at?
I'm not a professor anywhere.
Oh, I thought you taught. I'm sorry.
No, no. I do this on my quote unquote free time.
Okay. And we are about to hear his trip to Mexico to find a new cactus, a new species, and what it takes to define a species, as well as see a bunch of really wonderful plants. Tristan, would you like to begin?
I will. So let me do the share screen thing. Here it comes. All right. Give me the thumbs up if you can see my screen. All right. So yeah, the title of the talk is, Once Upon a Time in Oaxaca, the story of Cactus teplamensis. Say that 10 times fast. But as Erwin mentioned, this is going to kind of go over the story of the discovery of this relatively recently described species that we came upon on a research trip that we were doing in Oaxaca at the time. It wasn't for this plant. We didn't know that plant was there. It happened to be, we quote unquote stumbled upon it. And so this talk is going to kind of give you a background on, from the very discovery of this plant all the way up into the publication and what all's involved in that. And to give everybody kind of a sense of it ain't easy, because I know there's some people on this Zoom talk that have done these types of things, and when it comes out in paper, in a paper and is published, it certainly sometimes seems it's a lot easier than it actually is. There are a lot of struggles along the way. So I'm going to take you on a little trip and give you the background on how this came about. So the whole story begins on a research trip that I was invited to participate in to Oaxaca, Mexico, which is in southern Mexico. And the purpose of that trip was to obtain data on populations of agave titanota. And this is with Greg Starr. Greg Starr was leading this expedition. I'm sure everybody knows Greg Starr. He lives in Tucson here. And this is the first trip that I ever was invited on. So I was very excited. And it gives you an idea of where we were. We're down there in northern Oaxaca, in that white square. So brand new area for me to visit. I'd never been there before. So I was quite excited. And this was the location where we were headed to. And the location was identified through satellite images of the land, because agave titanota typically is restricted to limestone cliffs, steep limestone cliffs, which you can actually see often from satellite images as a whitish area. And so Greg was looking at the images and saw this limestone cliff looking area, as well as you can often see animal or human trails. And as you can see in this photo here, there are the cliffs up here, and here's the trail that we had originally knew that you could get to this area. So agave is here, trail there. And this canyon was about, depending on how fast you walk, 2 to 3 days hiking from the nearest community and the nearest roads. And so it did require a lot of backpacking and mules along the way to carry equipment. And so we arranged with the community to visit this place and take in this study. Oaxaca can be a little challenging to work in. The Oaxaca is kind of divided up into territories, and the local communities kind of own that territory and are can be very restrictive about access. So it's very important to get the local community involved, get permission from the local community, and also have a local community member participate in the trip as a guide. And so we had all that arranged ahead of time to make this happen. And so we drove to as close as we could possibly get disembarked from the trucks and loaded up all of our equipment on our backs and on the mules. And this was the valley that was viewable from our starting point, beautiful valley of palms, the Bahia Dulces, and pardon my pronunciation. So it was a really beautiful hike. And this was the start of the hike. All of us getting ready to go. There were about a total of 6 or 7 of us on the trip. And so this was the start of it. And there's the man himself, the myth, the man, the legend, Greg Starr. And that's our first agave along the way, agave Ocho Virens. And that's myself, obviously. And I'm a bird watcher. I study birds as well. So of course I always have to have my binoculars. So it was a pretty rough hike. Easy in some areas, fairly tough in some other areas, but the scenery was always beautiful. There's another bahia in one of the arroyos on the hike. Some of the interesting plants that we saw along the way, Echeveria picacii was one of the favorites. Beautiful, beautiful species of Echeveria, fairly common in the right habitats. Some of the other things we saw, Mammillaria crayonbuellii. I got back and I showed this to some people in Mexico, and they were saying that this is like one of the most massive specimens of Mammillaria crayonbuellii they'd ever seen before. So pretty cool plant. Lucky enough to be there when it was flowering. About halfway on the first day, we passed through a little hamlet to be able to refresh, sit down for a little bit, and water the horses a bit. But you can see the terrain that we're traversing, and our destination was actually this canyon down in here at the bottom of that canyon. So we still had a ways to go at that point. Some of the other plants we saw along the way, Pilosocereus chrysocanthus. I'm very partial to the genus Pilosocereus, so excited to familiarize myself with that in the field. And of course, a Bocarnia. I'm not sure what species that is, but very distinctive plant. Pherocactus flavovirens, a nice clumping pherocactus with orange flowers, always a treat to see. Mammillaria zyganthocenteron and Myrtillocactus, both present along the trail in various states of flowering. And the wonderful world of bromeliads, tillandsias were simply fantastic. And I am not a tillandsia person, so I've gotten these IDs from a friend of mine, but they were some of my favorite plants were the tillandsias that we would see. Another echeveria that we ran into is Pulvinata vera frigida, variety frigida, and Cephalocereus columna trajani. And Ipomea was encountered several times. I'm not sure which species this is, but beautiful, beautiful flowers. Another tillandsia, I think Erwin had an ID on this when I talked to him the other day, and I forgot to write that down, but one of the more spectacular ones. Not very big, just 3 or 4 inches across. And Agave convalis, formerly lumped into Kerchovia, but now recognized as separate. Then you've got some Opuntia as well as some Hechtias. And this trip, actually, the Hechtias are, although they're a bear to walk through, I really fell in love with Hechtias. They're just amazing plants, extremely hardy and sturdy, and very painful. So that's not the best part about them. Mammillaria carnea, we encountered occasionally. Unfortunately, they weren't flowering when we were there. And this was in February of 2017. Yeah. Mammillaria albulinata was probably one of the most common mammillarias we encountered. And then, of course, we have Vulficeps. And then we have Stenocereus marginatus, which especially people in Arizona are quite familiar with, I'm sure, the Mexican fence post. And some more Pilosocereus chrysocanthus. I threw an extra one in there. They get amazing plants. Excuse me. Towards the end of the first day, we made it all the way to the top of one of the mountains, and now we have to actually go down. So what goes up, got to come down. The trail, luckily, the guide didn't walk too far ahead of us because sometimes it's really easy to lose the trail in these rocky areas like this. Another hectia, just absolutely gorgeous plants. Agave stricta, which was a little bit of a surprise where we were, but very nicely formed plant there, which is now in a Kino agave. If you've read the paper from a couple of weeks ago, it's that group has been moved into a Kino agave. And one of my favorite group of plants is the Fucarias. So very overjoyed that Fucaria purpussii was in the area and was able to find that in the field. Spectacular, spectacular plants. And at the end of the first day, this is as far as we made it. So we found a nice flat spot on a ridge, not too far from our destination. And so we had a nice rest, but the agaves we were looking for are down in that valley right there. So the next morning was going to be rough because it's a very, very steep switchback trail with a lot of scree, loose rubble on the trail. So even the donkeys and the mules had a difficult time staying on the trail. It was so slippery going down. It was a great place to camp, though. Great place to rest and sit after a long day of backpacking. There's Greg Starr. And so the next morning, first thing, we headed down the switchbacks and caught a nice little picturesque Fucaria purpussii on the way down. And Nidosculus multilobus, which is the common name is mala mujer, which is bad woman. Anybody who works in Mexico and much of the tropics is quite familiar with these. They may look really, really pretty, but they are sting really badly when you touch them, when you just brush up against them. So not my favorite plant in the world to actually get too close to. And a good, nice Isolata cereus as well. So coming down the trail, we could get the first glimpses of where we're headed. Our plan was to spend the night down at the bottom of the canyon, and you can see the cliffs just above the canyon where the agaves were supposed to be. So that's our destination, which is a pretty nice little area. The actual community that we were working within, they have some old orchards down in this little valley. So it made for a very nice place to set up camp while we worked on our research. And sure enough, when we got down there and we looked back at the cliffs, agave titanota was all over the place. Very distinctive agave with very pale whitish blue leaves against the limestone. Plenty of them. So we had a lot of work to do, planning to do a lot of measurements of the agaves in various stages of growth. And while we were doing our research and looking along these cliffs, running into other plants, my Mammillaria viperina was a very relatively common mammillaria on these cliffs. On the trail, on the way down, we ran into this plant, which is an agave. We think it might be Petrophila, though unusually it had this significant trunk, a very distinctive trunk to it. So someday we'll have to get back down there and take a look at these in more detail. This was an interesting plant that we ran into. It's actually a Nyctocereus. And right now everything's lumped into some serpentinus, but I know that there are a couple of other names like Nyctocereus oaxacensis, which is also available for the populations in the area. So I'm not quite sure on what the final taxonomy of that is right now. I think everything's lumped into serpentinus right now, though. And then on the way down, very close to the bottom of the canyon near our campsite, I ran into this thing, not far off the trail. And so we're thinking, I'm not quite sure what this is. I did some studying ahead of time for what cactus should be in the area, but it just didn't seem to fit anything that I remembered. So took some pictures and kept going. It's a bigger mystery. What could this be? We really couldn't say, but it's like, yeah, we'll figure it out, right? When we think about it. Initial thoughts was, is it some kind of small pharaoh cactus? It was only about 4 to 5 inches across. I know there are some pharaohs that are fairly small. Pink flowers is relatively unusual in pharaoh cactus, but it's not unheard of. A kind of cactus, but there was nothing that even came close to this plant in that genus. And then we were also thinking maybe thelocactus, but to our recollection, thelocactus wasn't supposed to be there. I guess we also started thinking maybe gymnocactus, because some of the gymnos have this very splayed spines like this and short flowers that barely extend beyond the length of the spine. So I know that was one genus we thought about, but gymnocactus, once again, not found anywhere near here. So we were just a little confused, figured maybe it's some kind of hybrid, some weird plant that, although we had no idea what the parents would be. So it's like we took our pictures and moved on, made it down to the base of the canyon, bottom of the canyon. And this was our base for a couple of days of agave data collecting. We had a beautiful water source coming out from underneath the mountain. Really fresh, clean water, beautiful place to camp within these old orchards that the community had set up. And so we sat down and started collecting data. And usually that meant them pointing to agaves on the cliff and saying, Tristan, go get that one and go measure that one. And so I would head up those cliffs very, very carefully. And you'd think the rocks would be the most difficult part of climbing up and down. And that actually wasn't the case. It was actually the mala mujer, trying to avoid the mala mujer while you're climbing up and down these things. And while running up and down the hillsides, as we were collecting data and doing our measurements, we kept running into this cactus again. And so it's really interesting. So we took some more pictures and started noticing they all had the same characteristics. They were fairly common in the right habitat, typically on semi-exposed limestone rocks on fairly inclined cliffs faces. And they were both solitary and clumping, although much of the clumping seemed to be facultative clumping. In other words, in a cliff environment, the seeds would wash down the cliff and then they'd all get caught up in certain cracks. And so you'd have multiple seeds germinating from the same place. So it may look like it's clumping, but it's not an individual plant, it's multiple plants. But there definitely were individual plants that were offsetting as well on their own. Some of them were literally hanging from the cliff. So it's a very curious plant. One of the distinctive things we noticed was the spines were not distinguishable between radials and centrals. They were very undifferentiated, is what we say. And plus, they have pretty significant ribs with grooves in between the areoles. So it was well exposed and easy to locate in the right habitat. If you ventured out of that habitat, which consisted of these limestone cliffs with some kind of vegetation cover, and you know, for example, limestone cliffs where the Titanota were, where it was fairly well exposed to the sun, especially in the afternoon, you would not find these. They needed some kind of protection from the sun. But in the right area, they seem pretty common. How many can you find in this photo? In this photo alone, if you guessed 8, you are correct. There are 1 there, 2, 3, 4. A nice large clump. This was actually the largest plants we found of the species during our trips. 1 down here, another there, and then a smaller one down at the bottom. So just in one photo, you've got 8 plants right in the right habitat. So definitely not uncommon in the right habitat. This is one of my favorite clumps. I mean, literally, they're just clinging to the side of a cliff face. But really spectacular little cactus. I know some people have since said that it's one of the uglier cacti that have been described in the last 10 years. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but maybe I'm a little bit biased. But what set it apart in our minds was this combination of characteristics that kind of made it unique and confused us about what could this possibly be. Some of those characters include small purple flowers that barely extended beyond the spines, both clumping and solitary habitat or habits. The spines tend to be undifferentiated, loosely arranged, fairly radiating, although not splayed and radiating to the sides strongly. And they had these distinct vertical ribs. So all of these characters combined kind of precluded anything else we were thinking of at the time. But of course, we're in this deep canyon in the backcountry of Oaxaca, Mexico. We didn't exactly have any internet access to do some searches online. So at that time, we figured, well, when we get back to civilization, we'll be able to look, and it's like, it'll probably go, be a slap your forehead moment. It's like, oh gosh, yeah, that's what it is type of thing. Oh, and then there was the steep limestone habitat they were restricted to. So now what do we do? So we got back to civilization after we'd done our agave research and started doing those internet searches even before we got back to the States. And lo and behold, nothing made sense. It just did not fit anything that we could find in the literature, online, and actually sent photos of the plants to a couple of friends that are fairly conversant in those taxa, including the late Jordy Menzel, and many people were stumped, and there were several different guesses as about what they could possibly be, and they did fit kind of what we were thinking too, is Phaerocactus, Thelocactus. One was a stenocactus or a kind of cactus, depending on your taxonomy that you follow. So by this time, we figured out this is definitely something new. How new, where it's classified in, would have to wait. We have to go back and we have to get a specimen. In order to describe a new species or a new taxon or really determine its affinities, you really need to have a specimen, and that specimen needs to be stored in a herbarium for future study of that holotype, which defines the characteristics of a given species. We were on an agave trip. We did not have permits to collecting or anything like that. So we did not have any plants or seeds or fruits or flowers that we took. So all we had was the photos that we took of the plants to make these determinations. So we definitely need to do a return trip specifically for this plant. Of course, the most important thing to do when you're working anywhere and plan on doing any collecting whatsoever is you have to find a way to get the permits. And the permits are on various levels. You have to get your federal and state permits. We were actually working within the Tehuacan-Cuicatlan Biosphere Reserve. So that is a whole additional set of permits and permissions and red tape that you have to go through to obtain permission for that. Of course, one of the big things for all these scientific studies is you've got to find funds for the return. It's not an easy trip. Like I said, it's a minimum of 4 days, 2 out and 2 back. And it's all backpacking. And so you have to hire mules, you have to hire the guide, all those kind of things. So we did need to access funds. And then we had to figure out what's the right time. We were there, like I said, in February, which seemed to be a decent time for flowering, but most of the flowering seemed to be over. Not a lot of plants were in full flower, but no plants were in mature fruiting. There were a couple with like what appeared to be like immature fruits, but it definitely was too early for fruiting time, too late for peak flowering time. So we have to identify when's the best time to get back there. And like I said, whether or not they're blooming is critical because you want to get specimens of flowers to incorporate into a description if it is a new taxon. Have to accommodate the weather. We were in the dry season. The wet seasons in the area starts a little bit later in the year. So we want to make sure we don't get there during the wet season, preferably with all the hiking and cliff climbing, clambering that you have to do. And then one of the biggest issues is coordination of all the schedules, because we've got schedules of not just myself and Greg, and but also the local community and any people that want to accompany us from the organization that runs the Biosphere Reserve, all of that kind of stuff. So coordination of schedules is actually a pretty difficult part of this whole process. And of course, especially because we're working with Oaxaca, it's important, it's mandatory to get official permission to access the site from the local community. They have a community center downtown where they meet occasionally. They have an office. You've got to go to the office. You've got to ask permission. They'll, you submit summary of what the work you want to do and what it's going to take. You have to pay fees and you have to hire guides, all that kind of stuff. It is critical. You can have everything set in place, and if the community says you can't go, you simply can't go. It is 100%, in that case, controlled access by those communities. And oh yeah, I guess we got to figure out what it might be. So that's definitely other things to do, but that'll have to wait until we actually can make a return trip. So immediately I started looking for collaboration with somebody in Mexico that could help us around the red tape or through the red tape of getting permits and coordinating with the local communities. And so in April of 2017, so this is only a few months after we returned, I had been able to get a hold of Hector Hernandez, who is a very preeminent botanist on cactus in Mexico. He is professor at the University in Mexico City, and asked him to collaborate on this, and he was overjoyed and agreed this is definitely a new species. So he was very excited to help out. He had the appropriate permits, or he was able to get them in very short order, including the permits from the biosphere. And Hector and Carlos were the two people that were involved, and Carlos is his lab worker, and he's the one who maintains the herbarium specimens. And so he would be involved in the collecting of the plant and preparing the plant for the herbariums and things like that. They were able to get both federal and state permits, as well as the biosphere permits through their contacts. And over the phone, they were able to talk with the community and did get permission from the community for both of them, Hector and Carlos, to come down, drive down all the way from Mexico City to Oaxaca. Luckily, we have GPS coordinates nowadays, pretty much of everything. And with plants, it's very easy to relocate plants that way. So they had the GPS coordinates of the plants that we found, so they knew exactly where it needed to go. They were going to work with the same guide that had taken us out there for the agave trip anyhow. And so the intent was for them to go down there, get the specimens, bring them back, and then we'd coordinate between myself and Greg and them in Mexico City on doing the research and writing on the paper and all that kind of stuff. So sure enough, we got everything checked off our list. So they hopped in a car in April of 2017, and their little truck from UNAM, and drove all the way down to Tepomeme in Mexico, where the community was going to let them continue the process, and they couldn't get in. The community had changed their mind. Nobody's quite sure what exactly happened in the interim, but they were actually turned away. So they actually they went all that way, and they had to turn around and drive all the way back to Mexico City. And so we started working. I started communicating with the community as well as Hector, and making sure that there were no misconceptions about what we were there for. They're very protective of their community and of their natural resources. So it's a great community to work with, because they have that mental, cultural aspect of wanting to protect what they have, which is absolutely fantastic. But we ended up getting them to finally agree. And so we made a second attempt. So this was all the way, it took several months to get all those arrangements done. So our second attempt, Greg and I were both able to actually go on this trip. So this was in January. So it's a month earlier than we had previously been there. So hoping to catch them in full flower. And we had a pretty big crew this time because everybody wanted to go. So the more the merrier. It was pretty exciting for everybody. So from left to right, we've got Carlos Gomez Sinestrosa. He's the herbarium guy from UDAM that works with Hector. Leticia Soriano Flores from CONAMP, which is the organization that manages the Biosphere Reserve. So she is the one, and her ABAS are the ones that provided the permitting process for collecting within the preserve. Jeff Chemnick, I don't know if he's on, but fantastic person to have in the field. Not only does he have great communication skills with the locals, but he knows a lot about different things. Especially, I particularly enjoyed spending time with Jeff because he's, like myself, both a bird person and a plant person. So I had somebody who I could talk bird nerd stuff with during the trip as well. Next to him is Hector Hernandez from UNAM. So he's, if anybody does any research in Mexico and Cactaceae, they certainly have know of Hector if they haven't met him directly. That's myself, and the picture is very, very misleading. I'm actually not the shortest one. I'm just standing in about a 3-foot depression. Trust me. Then we had Deanna Seal, who actually was, I think she's from Minnesota or Wisconsin, somewhere where it's cold. For us in Arizona, it's like anybody north of us, we don't track where they're from. But she was actually with the Peace Corps and working with CONAMP, which is the organization that runs the Biosphere Reserve, when this invitation went out. And so she wanted to be on this as well and help us collect data. So we were all about that. She was a great person to have along, and definitely a lot younger, so that she was willing to climb up cliffs and measure in places that I tended to not be able to reach. Then we've got the infamous Greg Starr and his trusty sidekick, the mule. And then Brian Kimball, which he may be on too. Everybody knows Brian Kimball at the Ruth Bancroft Garden. So he joined us, as well as Walker Young, also from Ruth Bancroft. And so pretty big group. There were some people that aren't in the photos. Sylvia Salas from Cerbo, which is a botanical facility in Oaxaca City. She was critical in helping us get some of the permits, as well as communicating to the local community about the efforts and future of the plants in the area. But as soon as she saw that backpacking was involved, she got in a bus and went home. So she did her job and said, peace out. And she was gone. And then of course, we had David Garcia Martinez, who is the local representative from the town of Tepelmeme. So he was our guide for the trip. Very, very much into protecting the natural resources of his community, and proud of that, and rightly so. Very much into photography, and his pictures of the plants and animals are plastered all over the community center in downtown Tepelmeme as well. So he was a great guy to have on the trip with us, and serving as the guide. So back we go. So another 2 days of hiking back to this area, which looks vaguely familiar. And as we walked down the second day down that switchback trail, started to keep an eye out for the cactus this time, since this is the first time we knew it was out there, but didn't know the first place we would run into it. And luckily I have binoculars because I'm a bird watcher. So I found the first ones way up there on the cliff. So extending the quote unquote range of the plant by several hundred meters. But they're definitely there. So we were quite happy. And so we immediately got to camp, unloaded, and started clambering around the rocks, taking as much data as we can on as much individuals as possible. Many were just simply out of reach. And so it was a very exciting and enjoyable time of finding the different plants and getting data. Sure enough, almost all of the decent sized plants were in flower. So we timed it perfectly, and definitely got plants with flowers. And we actually were able to find plants with a mature fruit here at the top and a immature fruit down at the bottom. And anybody that is familiar with Thelocactus type fruits, you will see that it is a classic Thelocactus type fruit, which we'll talk about later as one of the characters. But found that they're a little bit more expensive than we thought, but as long as the habitat was the same. Exposure was very important. So you'd find perfect habitat. And if it was on a Western exposure where it got a Western sun, they would not be there. So they definitely needed very specific microclimate to grow properly. So as a part of describing any new taxa, there are relatively few requirements, but one of the primary requirements is there must be a holotype designated. And that holotype is an individual specimen that represents the best features of that cactus as it's described. And so we did some looking around and just like, how does this one look? Or does this one have the best representative of all the characters that make up this new taxon? And we finally all decided that this plant was the best representative of this new cactus. And so it was decided this was going to be the holotype. We had permits to collect the holotype for preparation for the herbarium specimen, and that's it. So we did not collect any other plants besides this one individual plant. And once we identified it, before we pulled it out, of course, everybody wanted to get their picture next to the plant. Pretty nerdy. I got to be with my notebook, but then I thought, I opened it up to a page where there's no notes, so that's not really helpful. But Greg did a lot of great photography. He's a great photographer in the field. So he had a lot to do with a lot of the great pictures we got of the plants. And then Carlos was let loose on the plants to do the collection, and because he's an expert preparator for herbarium specimens, and so he knew exactly what to do. And even though we had a little hand pickaxe and everything, it was really tough getting through these rocks. He had a very hard time getting much of the root at all, but we certainly got enough of it to make it a very valuable specimen. Everybody's quite happy, even David. And anybody that's ever met David, the local guide from Tepomeme, this is probably the only time in your life you've seen him smile. He has a fantastic sense of humor, super guy, but his sense of humor is drier than the Sahara Desert. And this was literally the first time I'd ever seen him smile. So it was really great to see, and because it just exemplifies the pride they have in their natural resources and how proud he was to be a part of this trip and what it meant to the community as a whole. So really one of my favorite pictures from the trip. And another group shot of us all together. The plant was actually, that we're staying on the trail, the plant, we looked at it, the holotype was actually just above Carlos's shoulder there on the cliff. So it was very close to the trail, luckily, very easily to access. So we had a pretty relaxing trip back. It was very successful. We spent one night down at the bottom of the canyon before we trekked back. Everybody was quite excited with all the data that we got. We were convinced at that point that it was a brand new species. We were not convinced about what genus it should be in. So that would take more work trying to figure out what that would be. And I apologize, my dog apparently started barking. So some of us relaxed a little bit more on the trip back than others. Greg took advantage of one of the mules. But admittedly, if there were more mules, I think everybody would have pretty much been on the mule back as well. But it was a great trip back. Brian Kimball, I had to put this in. The man is a beast. And if you ever are on a trip with Brian Kimball, don't anticipate you being the first one arriving to any rare cactus, because he will beat you to it. The man can move pretty quickly. One of my favorite people to spend time in the field with, not just super knowledgeable, but super nice guy, and keeps me on my toes. We tended to take a lot of breaks on the way back. And on those breaks, we discuss, what could this possibly be and things like that. We got permission from the local community halfway back to spend the night in their little chapel. And outside that night, we had a little campfire, and everybody huddled around the campfire. And one of the topics that came up is, well, we're pretty sure this is a new taxon. What should we name it? Regardless of the genus, the species name is what we would have to figure out and decide on a name. And we were asked by the person in charge of from the Biosphere Preserve, as well as from David and the other representative from the community that was there that night. if we could possibly name this new taxon after the community itself. So we did. Obviously, we were more than pleased to do that. And the only reluctance was the fact that the community's name is Tepomeme. So that would result in rather much of a tongue twister. But we were more than happy to honor that community's dedication to natural history by naming this plant when it finally got published. So back at town, what is it? So what's that process we had to go through? What we finally settled on is Pherocactus versus Thelocactus. And for anybody currently familiar with the taxonomy of Pherocactus and Thelocactus, this question, what exactly is a Pherocactus or Thelocactus, is not an easily answered question. Recent studies have shown that Pherocactus is highly polyphyletic, which means there are Pherocactus in that that are considered Pherocactus right now that are more closely related to other genera than they are to other species of Pherocactus. So it's not a natural grouping as currently recognized. Thelocactus itself is actually nested within the Pherocactus clade or tree of life. And in those studies, which included Thelocactus, only a few species were included. And some of those of you that know about Thelocactuses, there's several disparate species of Thelocactus involved. Plus, these studies often had low confidence levels with how the genera and species are arranged within that Pherocactus grouping. Here's a couple of examples that'll show you. So you can see Thelocactus, there's only 3 species included, are over here in this branch, but the closest relative of it to this branch is Pherocactus robustus. There's Pherocactus all around here. Then you have Leuchtenbergia, which we all know is very closely related to Pherocactus and actually hybridizes with it. But you've got Glandular cactus up here and Pherocactus latispinus. So it's quite a mess. Pherocactus hystrix in this branching actually is more closely related to Stenocactus and some of the mammaloids that are up there as well. So that's not too helpful. A 2011 cladogram phylogeny only used these 2 quite different thelos in their phylogeny. They're also sister to one of the species of Pherocactus, but then that group is sister to Stenocactus and Leuchtenbergia. And so it still doesn't help us resolve because Pherocactus is also over here, latispinus. There's a Sclerocactus in there as well. So that's not much help. So really what we had is, what are the options? So one of the options, which a couple of people were proponents on, was just describe it in a new genus. It is so kind of bizarre out there, we can't figure out exactly where it fits in until a new phylogeny is created with some confidence and some taxonomic nomenclature changes have been made. It's going to be impossible to figure out what's the correct assignment. So putting it in a new genus would be great, but what that does, it leaves it others to determine the correct placement. It's kind of kicking the can down the road and saying, well, eventually somebody will lump that genus into something else. So like I said, it's likely subsumed into another genus at some point in the future. We could put it in Pherocactus because all that group may end up being called Pherocactus one day. But doing that right now without completely reworking Pherocactus, it may imply relationships that are inaccurate. So when I say, if we describe it as a Pherocactus, that somebody looking at it may think it's more closely related to Pherocactus hystrix than it is to a Thelocactus, which is not necessarily the case. So that has a disadvantage to it. And then Thelocactus, if we put it in Thelocactus, really without reworking Thelocactus and how it's related to Pherocactus, may also imply that same thing, that some things are inaccurate and misleading. So the last option was, let's look at all the different species we have available, determine the one species within Pherocactus or Thelocactus that the new species is closest to, and describe it in that genus. And that's what we decided to do. So we took a look at all of the potential close relatives of this plant within Pherocactus and Thelocactus, and we came up with Thelocactus leucocanthus, specifically Leucocanthus schmollii. Leucocanthus nominate is a yellow-flowered plant. Schmollii is a magenta-colored flower. And here's a specimen of Thelocactus Leucocanthus schmollii. You can see definitely there are some similarities, but there are some distinctive differences. The similarities include size that's prominent to Berkeley's, separated by grooves. Grooves are a little more apparent in Leucocanthus, though. Comes in both clumping and solitary forms, has distinct ribs, flower color same. Seeds are also very similar. Differences is the size and shape of the flowers. A little bit of color difference in the flowers. Very distinct centrals and radials. And then Leucocanthus schmollii also often gets this spiral pattern to it, which we never saw in the new one. So looking at the range, this is the range of all the different species of Thelocactus. And that yellow star is where the new taxon was. So it's definitely out of range for a Thelo. But if you look at what the southernmost populations of Thelocactus are, that tends to be Leucocanthus, including schmollii. So geographically, biogeographically, it does make sense. There are other instances where there are Chihuahuan desert taxa that are primarily Chihuahuan desert that do trickle over into the northern Oaxaca and southern Puebla areas. For example, the Mammillaria hernandezii group is primarily north, whereas Bertholdii is a relatively recently described species from Oaxaca. And there are some geological papers that were published that indicate a tie between those two areas. So it's not out of the realm of possibility as far as historical biogeography of the taxon. So now that we figured out what we're going to do with it, now we just have to write the paper, right? Anybody that's written these papers know that it's just not just write the paper. There's a lot of work to it. So primarily, the first thing, of course, is you have to prepare that specimen that was collected. This was done at UNAM in Mexico City at the herbarium there by Carlos, who was with us. And this is his original herbarium sheet for the plant. It is still at UNAM. That's where it will live. Isotypes, which are additional specimens taken of that same plant, were made and were deposited at other institutions as well as kind of a backup of the holotype. We were able to get micrographs of the seeds to identify some differences in the seeds with the new species. And then we have to decide on where to publish. And for those of you, particularly in the academia, are aware of, different journals have different scores for university to consider, how important or how impactful it is. So certain journals get a higher score than other journals. For example, if you're a peer-reviewed journal, will have a higher score than a non-peer-reviewed journal. So Hector Hernandez specifically requested that we publish in Phytotaxa, which is an online journal that is peer-reviewed and is rapid to publish. So once we've figured that out, we select photos, drawings, figures, tables, put all those things together, write out the paper, and that includes an abstract, intro, etymology, which is just assigning the name to it, diagnosis, which is a comparison, description of the taxa with comparison with other taxa, distribution, habitat, what we consider one of the most important components of new species descriptions nowadays, a conservation and population status, if at all possible, and then acknowledgement and references. That's what makes up the new description and naming of the plant. So we got to the finish line. In July 2018 is when it finally was published online in Phytotaxa. That is the cover of the online journal. They selected our photo as the cover article, and this is the citation. It actually popped up on Google the very next morning. If you Googled Thelocactus teplomensis, which is what the final name was, you would have found it the very next morning. Somebody had gotten on it very quickly. So this name came from the community of Tepomeme. At Latinized, we add the ends at the end. So that's the reason for the tongue twister of the name. To help out, we recommended, and if you want to call it by its English name, the Tepomeme cliff cactus, which is only slightly more palatable. So just to sum up, from discovery, here's a timeline in February 2017 to publishing in 2018. We were very proud of the fact that we were able to do this in such a short time frame, a total of 17 months from discovery to publication. And the reason we were able to do it that quickly is because of the rapidity of the speed of obtaining grants to be able to do that and publish quickly. And the importance of publishing quickly is multifold. Conservation awareness, location protection, community awareness was huge. Because the community actively protects that area right now. They've actually put up camera traps to catch anybody coming into the area without permission, ensuring ongoing survival, encouraging additional study. And now that it has a name, there are covered protections that could apply to it as well. So for being able to do all this is thanks to the Tucson Cactus and Succulent Society Research Grant Program. We got grants from them to be able to do both the first and the second trips, and they were able to turn those around very quickly. And that is the reason that we were able to accomplish this in such a short time frame. So many, many thanks to the TCSS and its membership for supporting our work. As a last slide of the talk, there's your Thelocactus teplomamensis. And we did open publish it, so it is accessible at the DOI URL down below to anybody without paying anything. It costs more, but thanks to the research grant, we were able to open publish so that it could get disseminated to a wider population more rapidly. So with that, I hope that helps explain, how we went about this process and what was involved, and enjoy it. So thank you.